you will discover why you need to be intentional about your podcast's growth strategy and how to know if it's working or not. So for context, this is a clip that was taken out of a Roast the Show episode from our podcast, Why Your Podcast Isn't Growing. Every other Monday, we invite one of our listeners on and we roast their show and we give them a live podcast audit to provide them and you personalized guidance on how to grow their shows, how to solve their current podcast growth and marketing challenges. So this is exactly what you're about to watch right now. So if you're new here, my name is Anthony Winery and I'm the founder of GetMoreListens.com, a company helping entrepreneurs of podcasts turn a slow growth show into a rapidly growing positive ROI show. I've also published multiple best-selling books, yada, 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 all that good jazz. Anyways, this is a clip taken from one of our episodes. I hope you enjoy it. In this episode, you will discover how to pinpoint and overcome stagnation in your podcast growth, why trying to maintain your podcast growth by just putting out good content and good episodes isn't enough to grow, and how to effectively create, test, and validate whether or not a podcast marketing strategy is working or not. Context, we have Kyle and John, who are the hosts of the two shows, The Canadian Wealth Secrets and the Making Math Moments That Matter. Making Math Moments That Matters is the podcast that we'll be focusing on when it comes to our podcast audit today. For them, they experienced a phase of rapid growth where their podcast was actually reaching 10,000 listeners per week. Then they experienced over time a plateauing of their growth, leading to a period of stagnation. In the last 6 months, it's been a steady decline in terms of their listenership, and they're now averaging around 5,000 listeners per week. Again, that's context for this particular episode. So the focus of this episode is really these things here. Why this has happened in the first place, what things they can do to change it, and how they should adapt their podcast marketing strategies moving forward. So without further ado, let's dive straight into the episode. 100%. So I think in terms of, let's say an action plan moving forward, because you don't really know until you test it. And the easiest way to test it is just by being intentional. Okay, for the next 90 days, I'm going to make a list of 10 high profile guests within our industry. I'm going to have a look at their following account. I'm going to see if they're active and I'm going to reach out to them directly. We're going to get them booked on a show and we're going to track on average, what's our average download per episode? How much of a percentage increase do we get compared to the average download when we get this person on? Cool. It's significant. Why? Is it because something that we did or something that they did? Did they put it on their website? Did they share it with their audience? Did they share it on their Instagram? Did they not? Was it their story? Were their audience more engaged? But at least you have the intention of, okay, because right now we're in hypothesis mode. We're creating hypothesis. Yeah, this could be it. But if we just isolate just this one thing, this one theory of, hey, let's get bigger high profile guests on and let's see what happens with a baseline of what our average download is on average. Just start there. And then at least you guys, instead of having stagnant growth or declining growth and thinking what's going on, what's happening, you can now start isolating some of these variables. Oh, what happens when we add it to a website that is embedded? Does it change or does it not? But again, it's isolating all the things you just mentioned when it comes to, okay, are we interviewing the wrong people? Great, isolate that, figure it out, test it. Right. Is it maybe the other things, I think in terms of the exposure piece, what happens when we get on more podcasts? What happens when we do get shout out? Do we see an increase? So for example, me and Tig, we recently had a shout out on our podcast and we looked at our baseline as a tracker, our analytics. On average each day, how many downloads are we getting? Got that number, great. When we had a shout out on this podcast, we had a 20 to 30% increase on that day. And it was on the day that it dropped. That's not random, that's significant. Cool. How can we find more shows like that? But we had other shows that I was a guest on and there wasn't a significant increase. So what does that mean? That type of show, I just avoid and stay away from. This type of show, how do I find more of the shows like this and just do more of that? Test again. Do I get the same result? Great. Test again. Third time, do I get the exact same result? Amazing. Now I know the strategy is validated. It works. Yeah. Now I can put my forward. But right now, I feel like where you guys are stuck. And because you guys aren't people, you guys are action takers. I know you guys will work with you. You like taking control and taking that steps forward. But I think what happens is when you can't really see or you don't really know where to start because you have all these different ideas of what it could be, and you're not isolating one of them to just tackle one at a time, you're almost, not overwhelmed is the wrong word, but you're so scatterbrained that you don't even know what step to take forward necessarily.
Right.
but it's just all these floating ideas. Am I making sense? You guys follow me so far?
Absolutely.
For sure. I think, a big takeaway so far is that intentionality. And I think we do that in other areas of our business. We just need to do that in this area. And I think we've also admitted for the last few years in probably the stagnation is because we haven't dedicated, even though the podcast is probably our largest lead generation tool to bring people into our ecosystem. We still have probably just let it coast, not given it maintained attention or intentionality. Right. We haven't dedicated time to strengthening it. We just say, hey, we'll record this week. We'll record this week. We'll record this week. And the implications or the standard operating procedures we put in place 5 years ago, they're still in place today, but we haven't really spent time to go, should we change that? How do we go about changing it? And you're giving us some good next steps to say, if we're going to change it, let's change it with intentionality. So
100%. And just add on there, think about what you said there, maintaining. You never really maintain anything. If you just put a chair in the room and just keep it there.
Yeah.
And just keep it there, no matter how much you maintain it, entropy occurs. That's just a natural law of nature. Happens with computers, happens with our bodies, happens with chairs, happens with the world, happens with the sun. Entropy will happen when you just leave something and just let it coast. Mm-hmm. Things will just decay. That's just a law. You can't avoid that. You need to put more energy into that thing, into this machine, for it to do anything you want it to. And the intention of that and the focus and the clarity around how you approach that, it allows you to not only see clearly, but allows you to be able to make drastic changes because you know what you're looking out for and you know what to look out for and what not to look out for because your mind's in the right place. So I just wanted to say that because, you're totally right. And this is for our listeners as well. It's very easy once you're at a certain point. Oh, yeah, this is good. We'll just coast. Things are happening. Right. Why not? And you guys aren't the first people to say we haven't gone after the new guests because we have so many coming in. But then it's okay, great, you're having so many coming in, but what's your intention? What's your filter? What do you want? What do your listeners want? You're just giving your listeners basically whatever's coming to you rather than really thinking, how do we, again, reach more people? How do we approach it in a different way? Are these all the right people that we should be getting on? And that's, again, where things get a bit stale. It's not evolving, it's not innovating, it's just staying the exact same.
Yeah. And just to add on to that, I'm going to guess that we've managed to call it plateau versus say have that slow decline simply because we do enough work in the business, other parts of the business that it rubs off on the podcast, but it's not to the best maximized, optimized in the most optimized way. So I think that could also contribute to why it's not decreasing. It's not like it's getting stale. The content I think is shifting okay, but again, we're not paying enough attention to it. We should be probably blocking out more time, more effort to try to figure out what do we need more of, what do we need less of. And then I liked your idea too, the word filter. We use that a lot with our coaching clients that we work with in the education space, which is what matters to us. So when somebody does want to come on the show, what is going to be the deal breaker for that person, or what's going to be hey, this is win, everybody wins if this person comes on, instead of just having it as an open door type thing of, hey, whoever comes and we'll just go with it.
Absolutely, guys. I think it's a very common trend with podcasters that they're doing this alongside their business. It is very hard to not end up in a position where you are too close to the trees to see the forest. And it is one of those things where you don't set enough time to intentionally plan, to oversee. Even though it's the things you tell other people, it's the things you do in other aspects of your business, it's very hard to keep doing that consistently with a podcast. I'm curious because I don't feel like me and Anthony have said that much. Certainly Anthony a bit more than me with the profound chair analogy. But I guess, do you guys think you would have had a conversation like this? Or do you guys think you would have had this conversation if it wasn't for this kind of organized call?
Because we have each other, right? We chat about stuff like this occasionally, but I think what makes this more meaningful is because we have to communicate our thoughts to someone else. It makes it more real and then also more actionable, I think. It's now that we've had this conversation, it's shit, now we have to do this. Like now we have to go do this so that these guys know that we didn't do the things we just said
John's
we were
like,
going to
why did
focus
Kyle
on,
say
right?
yes
So it's
to
like
this?
there's an accountability piece, right? So that's partly when you have conversations with people, you feel like you got to live up to the things you said. When it's just Kyle and I, we talk about strategy, and then sometimes those things, when we decide that's a real focus, because we have lots of focuses, right? So it's where's the real focus? And so we just have to decide where the real focus is going to be. And then, but I feel like this has made this feel like this should be a focus.
Right. And just to add on to that, so John and I do spend a lot of time. We see similarities in you guys and how you guys operate. We operate our business at what appears to be in a very similar fashion. We are always talking about strategy, but the part that I think makes this a really helpful call, and working with you in general has made it a really great call, is like, you never go down a rabbit hole outside of this focus area. So like today, we just talked for an hour straight about the podcast, whereas every conversation we have, John and I, is it goes off to, what about the webinar that we're doing later that month? What about this lead magnet? What about, it's like you start going down and there's so many things that it's really easy to lose sight. So again, we'll go to the profound tag analogy of forest through the trees type thing, right? It's like we're there and there's so many things that need to be discussed that it can be really easy to let the discussion go into really helpful conversations, but you don't necessarily, or at least we don't dedicate currently enough time to actually strategizing for this very specific lead generator, which again, as John said, is one of our most important ones. We've identified that. We know that to be true, but I don't think our actions haven't modeled that behavior, right? If we know that it's true, then why aren't we committing more time towards this particular show? And I think this is a good sort of jumpstart for us to start doing that.
Guys, I think what you're saying there is about focus, right? It's about identifying what you want to do, why it's important, especially if you guys are business owners. So like there's been so many stories in the past of business owners. We have so many different things going on. Everyone's got so many different things going on. And when you're just getting started in business, it's great. You have to wear all these different hats and do all these different things. But as you grow, develop, and mature, it's then just how good is our decision making. That's what it becomes. Like, how good is our decision making? And for that is then, okay, how good is our focus? And when you come to a spot where you know this is the biggest lead generation for you, and there's going to be other parts of the business that might not be working as well or might be working well that you want to work better, you're then essentially sabotaging yourself in the short term and in the long term. What do I mean? There was a recent story about this entrepreneur who's making like $400,000 a month, doing incredibly well, has 6 businesses, going crazy, wild. He loved it. He loved the mayhem of like being all over the place and whatnot. He had a partner that would always say to him, hey, look, why don't you just focus on just a couple of these? You seem super stressed out. Things are going well, but maybe we can slow down a little bit and get ourselves quite focused because you're really scattered at the moment. He was like, no, it's fine. It's okay. I'm doing it. I'm crushing it. He eventually ends up making a few mistakes and hiccups, and he gets sued by one of the employees in one of the companies. It takes him out for a little while, and he had to reevaluate his entire decision-making process. He looks at the 6 businesses, and he has to cut some of them. He has to basically sell some of them because I think he had to sell like 6 of them, 6 or 5 of them to pick the ones to focus on to make up for him being sued or whatnot. Once he'd done that, he looked at his numbers and realized that there was only like really, again, the 80-20 rule. There was only 1 or 2 companies that were bringing in 80% of the revenue. And turns out those are the companies we're spending the least amount of time on. He sells the 4, focused on these 2, which again, the one with even better, but focused on these 2. And I think it was like a few years later, he's now making $4 million a month, right? And of course, that's like arbitrary numbers with the money or whatever. But it just goes to show the power of focus, of understanding where's my energy going? Why am I doing all these different things? And why am I trying to fix certain areas of my business that, yeah, it would be great if it was working, but is that energy spent just fueling something we know absolutely is working? And I think it's about having the perspective of how far do we think we can actually push this? Me and Ty recorded an episode literally yesterday, I think it was yesterday, where we spoke about most podcasters don't give their podcast what it needs because they're basing the effort they should put into the podcast based on where they are currently in their journey. But if I told you guys, by the way, next year, if you make all these changes, guaranteed you'll be at 200,000 monthly downloads and making 3x as much as you are now with the show. You'll be like, holy fuck, let's just give, dude, what the fuck? Let's put all of that energy in this. But you're only putting that, again, you're only focused on putting that amount of energy because you're basing how much energy to put into the show with where you are right now, not the real potential of what you're working on,
Right.
not the actual opportunity that's staring you in the face. And that's what, pardon my language, that's what fucks most people. They just don't realize what they're actually working on and how valuable it is. And there's going to be another guy who you're competing against who realizes that and sees it and then goes all in. And then what happens? That's really, again, to round that off, pick where the focus is, what's working for you guys, and just double down. That's the heart and soul of the business. It's going to be really important that you measure the amount of effort and focus you put into this based on the real potential and opportunity you have in the ideal world. What does the ideal future look like for you guys? That's very real and it's going to happen if you take the right steps and give it the right focus. If you don't, you just have more of what you have right now.
That's huge. And the part that's always interesting is after someone has success, be it in podcasting or whatever part of life, everybody always says, oh, like, would, nice to be them or whatever it is, but they don't know the actual journey. And actually, John, I think I sent you this message. What you reminded me of is Alex Hormozi. We're big fans. I think you guys are too. I think I was telling you, Anthony, that on our first call together, I was like, hey, I like how you did that. You used an Alex move. Alex on his show was saying that he was podcasting. I'm going to butcher the number, but it was like he was podcasting for something like 4 or 5 years, getting similar download numbers to what John and I have on our math podcast now. And I remember like that just hit me that I'm like, wow, he did it for 5 years to get to where he was, like just to start the hockey stick to where he is now. And John and I it's only 5 years that we've been doing the math podcast. So it's like or 4.5 or whatever it is. And you start to really think about that and go like, I think everyone just assumes like, oh, Alex Hormozi started the podcast like when they found out about Alex Hormozi, and you don't see how much energy, how much time, how much effort he had put into that in order to get to where he's at now.
So here are some takeaways from myself for you. Number 1, always be intentional about your podcast guest selection and overall podcast strategy. When we become overly reliant on guest requests, if your show is growing, you're thriving, you're having tons of people pitch to be your guest on your show, fantastic, and that's great, but you have to be intentional. You still have to be selective. Rather than just relying on guests, still be proactive. You should be the one seeking out guests based on the content strategy you've created for your show, based on the guests that you believe be the best suited to provide the most amount of value to your audience, which means you going out and doing a bit of hard work, getting your hands dirty, or if you have a team member or a VA, having them help you when it comes to guest outreach. Number 2, while it's good to have a content strategy that serves your existing audience, you shouldn't lose focus on creating a content strategy to reach a new audience. This means thinking about topical and trending topics. This means being more intentional about the guests you have on your show. This means you talking about current affairs, things that are trending in the industry that you're in, which will allow you to tap into a new audience. So constantly think about, how do I create a content strategy that will help me reach more new listeners? And finally, always keep improving your show. When things are going well, don't think and blindly believe that it's going to keep going that way forever. Don't wait for a massive dip in your downloads to change things up. Always stay focused. This is something that's so hard to do. We're an entrepreneur with a podcast, and the podcast is an arm of your business. You have so many things going on that take objection, and maybe right now the podcast isn't generating you the revenue or isn't as profitable as you would like it to be. So it then gets pushed to the side in the back line. But what then eventually happens is you get to a point where deep inside you know that if you build out an audience, the value is there. And again, there's a challenge and a tug of war and a fine balance we always have to play and always have to try to find. I know that I've personally find myself having conversations with Ty, my business partner, all the time about, hey, every couple of months, hey, dude, let's keep focusing on the podcast. How do we keep going? How do we make it better? And it should always be front and center of mind. And what we're trying to do and what we're trying to encourage our clients to do is to really approach the podcast as if it's a 6 and 7 figure venture, because it has the power to be exactly that if you take the right steps and prioritize building a highly engaged audience. I hope you've enjoyed this episode and I hope you found it super valuable. I'll catch you in the next one.